Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar with speakers from 39 Essex Chambers and from Dentons. My name is Nigel Pleming, and I have the honourable task of chairing this event. At a time when the UK newspapers and other media are devoted to sleaze allegations and details of soft furnishings at number 10, it is good to spend some time on a subject where it is common ground for government and for the offshore oil and gas sector that, and I quote from page 5 of the North Sea Transition Deal, climate change represents an existential threat to the planet. Climate change and what to do about it is a current pressing main topic around the world, with the new US administration now fully signed up to urgent action. As you will know, President Biden referred the other day to the decisive decade for tackling climate change. And yesterday, the Constitutional Court in Germany released its judgment, holding that in the context of climate change under the applicable German law, and I quote from paragraph 5 of the judgment, the protection of future freedom requires that the transition to climate neutrality be initiated in good time. Here in the UK, we have an ambitious plan to make our contribution to saving the planet, and the deal is an important piece in the overall jigsaw. As many of you will know, the deal has not received universal praise or support, with criticisms, for example, from Lord Debon, the chair of the Climate Change Committee, and by Green groups. The main objection seems to be that the deal, the new plan, allows for new oil and gas extraction licenses, even if subject to a climate compatibility checkpoint or test. The big question in science and policy terms is therefore as follows: is the North Sea Transition Deal an exciting new chapter, or is it bound to be a colossal failure? Our speakers will tackle some of the issues raised by the deal, and there will be time for discussion. Those of you familiar with Zoom webinars will see the Q&A facility for your questions or comments, and we will consider and respond to those questions, or at least some of them, at the end of the 4 speeches. The order of speakers is as follows. First, Adam Brown, who will speak on and set the context for the deal. Adam has a mouthful of a title at Dentons, but put simply, he has many years of relevant experience working on the regulation of and innovation in energy markets, including time with the DTI and DEC. Adam works closely with colleagues in the Dentons energy practice here in London and in Scotland, and advising clients on oil and gas regulatory matters, and many of the net zero technologies highlighted in the deal. He will hand over to Tromans QC, who will speak on carbon capture and storage. Stephen has specialized in environmental and energy law for most of his career, and has acted for many of the oil and gas companies in the North Sea and more widely, both in terms of strategic advice and matters such as exploration, habitats, decommissioning, and respect of specific incidents going back to the Brent Spar in the early 1990s. Our third speaker is Victoria Hutton, and she will be addressing decarbonising supply. Victoria is a barrister specialising in planning, environmental and energy law, and her experience ranges across the breadth of the energy sector, and she is currently being kept busy by EDF on projects relating to 2 nuclear power stations alongside Stephen Tromans. And finally, Juan Lopez, who recently joined our chambers, speaking on some net zero implications of the deal, as well as on how the deal envisages an enlarged role for hydrogen in prelude to the anticipated UK hydrogen strategy. Juan has much experience in renewables, infrastructure as a core element of his infrastructure planning, energy and environmental work, and is currently occupied on a series of UK energy from waste projects and on a trans-frontier waste shipment dispute. Juan was also recently instructed on the energy security of supply implications of one of the UK's last open cast coal mines. Each speaker has up to 20 minutes, and so over to you, Adam.
Thank you very much, Nigel, and thank you to the invitation, and good morning, everyone. So I was asked to go first, and I thought it would make sense to give an overview of what the deal is and isn't, and set in context. That's going to involve quite a lot of talking about things other than the deal, but I hope by the end you'll see the point of that. Wait, have the next slide, please. So, what is the North Sea Transition Deal? It fulfills a manifesto commitment from the last election to deliver a, quote, transformational sector deal for oil and gas. What's a sector deal? So these were a creature of the May government's industrial strategy, where they were called partnerships between government and industry to increase sector profitability. And they tend to be focused on things like collaboration, innovation, cost reduction, and so on. They're agreements in a loose sense, expression of shared good intentions between industry and government. They're not, I think, intended to create any legal effects. The bullet points on the slide here are taken from the forward to the North Sea Transition Deal itself. And the message is obviously clear. Everyone and the planet is going to be a winner. The industrial strategy that gave birth to the original sector deal is now, I think, a bit of a dead letter. Indeed, this deal isn't listed alongside the other ones on the BEIS website. But it has a family resemblance to them and shares some of their features. And we'll come back to that at the end of this. But to begin with, let's see something about the context, which I think is what marks it out. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start by looking at the background from the industry point of view. And the industry, of course, is a global one. And globally, it faces a range of pressures, as well as some potential opportunities arising from the move towards net zero, the energy transition. Some of these pressures are more commercial in nature, or indeed even geopolitical. Some are regulatory. If we look at the pressures at the top, you can see these are pressures on the old model of the industry, and they apply in varying degrees at different points along the supply chain from the upstream to the downstream. But all are relevant, I think, in one way or another to the upstream, which of course we're concerned with here mostly. And they will affect different parts of the industry differently, because different areas of production have, for example, different carbon footprints because of the geology and the process of production. There is a lot of uncertainty about all these things, how they will develop, and also uncertainty about the future role of gas, which in some ways is seen as the big hope for the industry. As we move on to the opportunities, you can see they're mostly around synergies with new or net zero energy technologies. What the slide doesn't show is that the North Sea, the UK continental shelf, is a relatively high cost and mature basin. And if you look at the most recent reports from Oil and Gas UK, which is the counterparty to the deal, along with the government, there's a lot of sort of less than totally good news. Capital investment hasn't really recovered since the period of low oil prices in the middle of the last decade. Drilling activity is at historically low levels. More wells are being decommissioned than are being drilled at the moment. So in a world where the industry has to shrink over the next 30 years, or we're all going to fry, and on some estimates we've already passed the peak of oil demand, you've got to be the cheapest and the cleanest to survive globally. And the question is really, if the oil and gas industry is going to invest in all the things that the Committee on Climate Change says that it must, the government says it wants to, does it want to do these things and realise the opportunities on that slide in the North Sea? So moving on to the next slide. From the government's point of view, the North Sea Transition Deal is one of a series of different things that are all pointing, going towards the same direction to try and make a proper energy transition happen in relation to what's going on in the North Sea. And there's also more than is on this slide, various things that are referred to, for example, in the Energy White Paper. But I'm going to focus a little bit on the strategy in particular before coming to the deal itself. Have the next slide, please. So for a while now, we've had the regime that was put in place in 2015, 2016, the Oil and Gas Authority, and everything that it does and everything that more or less everyone in the North Sea does, being governed by a strategy, the central point of which is maximising the value of economically recoverable petroleum from the North Sea. That was put in place when we already had the 80% reduction by 2050 target from the 2008 Act. Now we have the net zero target. It's understandable that there was a desire to make some changes to bring it up to speed with the new net zero world. And that's why has been added in alongside little a on the slide there, B, that requires people to take appropriate steps to assist the Secretary of State in meeting the net zero target, including by reducing as far as reasonable the circumstances greenhouse gas emissions from sources such as flaring and venting, and supporting carbon capture and storage projects. And obviously, on the one hand, for people who think, well, you should just do what they're doing in Denmark and have no more new exploration. On the other hand, some people felt this is a sort of big change to the strategy, and queried whether it was even within the underlying statutory powers. But it was consulted on and implemented pretty much exactly in the version that was the subject of the consultation. And there's quite a lot of change that runs through the strategy, and a lot of points of detail which probably isn't time to go into now. But essentially, the plan is that activities in the UK continental shelf need to have as low a carbon footprint as practicable, leaving it to some extent to other regimes to concern themselves with emissions from manufacture and use of petroleum products further down the value chain. And they've got to do what they can to facilitate development of low carbon energy businesses, like carbon capture and storage and hydrogen. And if they do that, they're going to improve the long-term economic sustainability of the traditional industry in the UKCS and the energy businesses that work within it. So, moving on to the next slide, the vision behind all this is one of so-called energy integration. This is what the strategy is supposed to help enable, and it's perhaps not too easy to see all the detail on that, but it's a kind of happy world in which there are, yes, still some oil and gas platforms doing traditional oil and gas things, but there are also lots of old ones that have been repurposed into places to house electrolyzers for green hydrogen production from offshore wind, with storage in the depleted reservoirs underneath them, and old pipes that are being used to maybe pipe some hydrogen ashore, or alternatively taking CO2 emissions from emitters that are located on the coastline there. And it's all working nicely in harmony. And that's why infrastructure is stressed a lot in the strategy. There's always a requirement to think about whether infrastructure could be of benefit to others, in particular, before, as an owner of infrastructure, you might decide to close it down because it's no longer making much money for its original purpose. And there are a lot of subtle sort of changes in the strategy that just give a little bit more bite to certain things. So where there are plans that are put forward by the OGA, if you do something inconsistent with the plan, you used to have to consult, but now you've got to demonstrate that your alternative meets the obligations in the plan. There is more increased obligation to collaborate, which was one of the original thoughts behind the whole regime the strategy is part of. It's a freestanding obligation now to collaborate. with other relevant persons. And although there's still this safeguard that no one is expected to undertake activities which there isn't an expectation of a satisfactory commercial return, as defined in guidance, but equally you can't just as a licensee sit on your hands. If you've made a firm commitment to carry out a work program, you can't surrender the license or let it expire just because it's going to be too expensive. You've got to get on with it. And there are some very interesting details as well about the requirement to factor in carbon costs in these processes. So moving on to the next slide, and don't adjust your screens at this point, because all I'm trying to do here is to make a broad point with a lot of fine print. Shortly after finalising the strategy, the OGA came up with something catchily titled Stewardship Expectation 11, which are one of a series of documents which flesh out the obligations in the strategy. And what it represents is, in the world, particularly of those people who are subject to strategy who are licensed, there are lots of points at which they have to get the OGA's approval or consent for what they're proposing to do. And what the bit of the expectation document that's cut and pasted here does is to look at all those decision points and say, in effect, these are the things that we're going to expect to see that you've been thinking about. And they're all things related to net zero in one way or another, whether it's reducing emissions or engaging positively with the CCS and hydrogen and so on. And I have highlighted some of the more important ones in purple. So the moving on to the next slide, this is a little bit more of the same. Are we there yet? It's not moving for me. Oh, yes, sorry, it is. And here, note it just goes further down the sort of life cycle of an asset. But it's worth noting in particular the last two headings, which relate to the whole process, because what those highlight is a requirement not just to think about direct emissions, but scope 1 and scope 2, if you like, but also to think about indirect emissions in the supply chain, insofar as licensing can control those. And that is indeed one of the things that the Committee on Climate Change said that they wanted to start to happen in relation to the offshore industry. So I'm going to say something quickly now on the next slide about this question of climate compatibility checkpoints. And this is something which is not in the deal document itself, but was highlighted in the accompanying press release, possibly because there'd been a little bit of sort of flurry around question whether actually the UK was going to do something a bit like Denmark had done. And well, no moratorium on new license rounds, but that there is a review which will produce its conclusions by the end of the year. And it's addressing, in a sense, two obvious problems. First of all, it does having new licensing rounds mean that you go beyond the trajectory that you need in order to get your net zero emissions nationally, or does having new licenses means that you go beyond what you need to get net zero in terms of what happens with the end users of petroleum products. And in a sense, you could answer the first of those questions without a checkpoint within the framework of the licensing, or indeed by an emissions performance regime. But what's interesting about the details that are on the screen is that this link to national energy supply, the idea of secure and diverse supply. You can ask the question, well, how does this fit with the visibility of government policy on all the things that are going to affect national demand for hydrocarbons, like electric vehicles, domestic heating, and so on. Or you can ask whether this is about sort of tacitly encouraging the industry to maintain aging processing and refining capacity so that still these things can be used in the UK. Or you can ask how you evaluate the impacts of a licensing round in these terms, and how it would differ from the existing sort of strategic environmental assessment process. Ultimately, I think that the key thing is shown also by the fact that the OGA last year did a report on how the emissions from the North Sea production are lower than those of LNG brought in from elsewhere, and that it's all about encouraging people to produce, to show that what is produced domestically will be better than demand being met from elsewhere. So, next slide, please. And very quickly on the deal itself. So I don't want to steal anyone else's thunder going into the details, but just to give a sense of the overall shape and what I think the essence of the bargain is. So you see some things on here are coloured red. Those are things which are predominantly for the industry to do. And some things are coloured purple, which are those things that are predominantly for the government to do. And very broadly speaking, whether it's decarbonising supply, that's the energy on the platforms and so on, whether it's CCS and hydrogen, industry is expected to invest. Government's job, yes, it's going to provide a little bit of subsidy, but the key thing is to provide the regulatory frameworks, because without the regulatory frameworks, no one is going to do CCUS, no one is going to do the hydrogen projects, because they will not be investable without the kinds of things that are mentioned there in purple, that are all very much on the government's plate. Then, if we turn to the next slide, one could be sort of flippant about this and say, well, this is, in a way, it's about global Britain, it's about levelling up. It's maybe even about persuading Scotland that it would be good to stick around. There's also a strong flavour of generally of ESG here. More seriously, I mean, it also goes to one of the points that I think was implicit in what Nigel was saying, the idea of a just transition. And if you look at all the releases that came out of the US last week around the time of the Global Climate Leaders Summit, the Biden administration, for all its climate-related things, stresses these are good union jobs, which is how they are. So, and it also, more seriously, comes down to the point that these are all quite technically difficult things that have got to be done, and for all that this is big engineering, it is also a people business, and you need the people with the right skills. But there's quite a lot on this slide that's coloured red again. So there's a lot that's down to the industry to do. And the emphasis on, I just point out, because I think Victoria's going to come back to it later, the emphasis on local content in supply chains there, because that's important. As it is, yes, thank you, next slide, in the context of the government's approach to offshore wind, where you've seen strengthening of the requirements, those who have to get contracts of differences, strengthening of the requirements to demonstrate effectively, again, local content in supply chains and face consequences if they don't live up to that. So to end where we started, the North Sea Transition Deal has a lot in common with other sector deals, and perhaps most obviously, as you might expect, with one with offshore wind, because obviously that's happening in all the same places. But there are some big differences as well. This is not just about nationally and globally promoting an industry which is generally assumed to be a good thing, which is roughly the case with all the other ones. This is something which exists in a sort of complex jigsaw relationship with climate change policy, and has to fit around a framework of sector-specific regulation that is, quite particular to this industry. And I think that's the context that it's important to see it against as we now look at the detail. And at that point, I shall end and hand over to Stephen.
Thank you very much, Adam. My topic is carbon capture and storage, which, as we will see, is actually quite central to much of this deal. I'm sure you all know what carbon capture and storage is, but just in case you don't, carbon is captured from a combustion facility, either by pre or post combustion technologies. It's transported by pipeline and or shipment, and it's sequestrated in suitable geological formations. Now, I'm conscious actually that the full acronym is CCUS, Carbon Capture, Use and Storage. I'm leaving use a little bit out of account for the purposes of this presentation. That's not to say it isn't important, but I think it's of less importance in relation to the North Sea transition deal. So to just give you an example of use, yesterday I read that Unilever in China had developed a product, detergent capsules for domestic washing use, which use a surfactant made from captured carbon. So a Chinese steel mill captures the carbon, that's converted into ethanol, exported to India, where it's processed to form ethylene oxide, transported back to China, who manufacture the surfactant and put it into the detergent capsules. So, that's a very good example. And obviously, in terms of waste hierarchy, to use carbon dioxide in that way is actually much better than essentially disposing of it as waste. But plainly, those technologies are not going to account in any way for the quantities of carbon dioxide that have to be taken out of the atmosphere or prevented from getting into the atmosphere to meet our goals. So if we move on to the next slide. Thanks very much. So what's the importance of carbon capture, use and storage? First of all, it's universally recognised by the International Energy Agency, the IPCC, the UK's own Committee on Climate Change as being essential, I underline that word, to the net zero goal. It's not a negotiable extra. It is fundamentally essential to arriving at net zero. And it's the only current way that we have of deep carbonisation of major industries, energy intensive industries, steel, cement and chemicals. Those cannot be, with current technologies, decarbonised, nor will they anytime soon. So there has to be some way of dealing with the CO2 which they produce. It's also a key, I think, to the production of clean hydrogen, which obviously is a very big, potentially future component of net zero in terms of heating, fuel as a fuel. And if you're going to produce that in a clean way, other than renewables, then you're going to need carbon capture, use and storage. It also has the capability, if it's coupled with gas-fired power plants, for example, to provide a much more flexible baseload for renewables than nuclear could. Renewables obviously suffer from the problem of intermittency. Intermittency is going to become an increasing headache as electricity use for charging up our electric cars and our electric-based rather than gas-based cooking come in. So plainly, you are going to need some way of effectively keeping the lights on, and CCUS would be much more flexible than nuclear power stations, which aren't easily turned on and off in doing that. And therefore, it's a key part of UK policy in its industrial strategy, its clean growth strategy, the Carbon Capture and Storage Infrastructure Fund, which it set up, and indeed, most recently, the Prime Minister's 10-point plan for recovery out of COVID. Next slide, please. What are the issues to be addressed? This is really the nub of the matter. So what needs to happen? First of all, the infrastructure for capture. So obviously you need to have heavy industry, combustion operations, steel, cement, power plants, chemicals in industrial clusters where the infrastructure can be put in to capture that carbon. And the government wants to see 4 of those clusters by 2030. Secondly, you need all of the infrastructure to actually store and transport that CO2 that's been captured by pipelines and then on vessels probably to get it out to the wells where it's going to be injected. Those wells have to be developed and maintained, and plainly all of that has to have investment. It's not going to happen, as Adam said, without investment by banks, by pension funds, by insurance companies, by venture capital, whatever it may be. And also it needs a system of regulation, both safety, environmental protection, and perhaps most importantly, economic regulation. I'll come back to those with, I think, actually the next slide, if we go to that. So how will the relevant operations be regulated? We have an EU directive dated back to 2009, which deals with carbon capture, use and storage. That has been transposed in the UK via the powers under the Energy Act and the carbon dioxide licensing regulations of 2010, providing essentially a licensing regime for the offshore storage of CO2 with the Oil and Gas Authority in English waters, or Scottish ministers if it's in Scottish waters. So the regulatory infrastructure for actually pumping the CO2 down into the wells under the seabed is there. Plainly, also rights will need to be acquired to get it there, and to do that from the Crown Estate or the Crown Estate Scotland. I dare say they will want to be paid for those rights. They usually do. And also we'll have to address the major accident hazard from the possible mass escape of CO2, especially if it's in a supercritical phase. That's not a negligible hazard, in fact, and that will have to be regulated by the Health and Safety Executive. But perhaps most importantly, there will be a need, as I'll come on to, for a new economic regulation regime to deal with the provision of the services of transporting and storing the carbon dioxide. So the next slide, please. How does all this fit in with the North Sea transition deal? There are a number of very important synergies, I think. First of all, the relevant expertise of the North Sea operators into the geology, well technology, pipelines, and general industrial safety. All of those are going to be very important for carbon capture and storage. Existing industry commitments to supporting net zero, and how it ties in with what Tora is going to be talking about shortly on the industry side of getting to net zero. Thirdly, the decline generally in North Sea production, lots of assets which are coming out of use, and a large asset base of suitable geology in abandoned hydrocarbon fields and in saline aquifers. Also, the geography is good in terms of the proximity of these sites in the North Sea to the potential coastal industrial hubs for capturing CO2, for instance, in the northeast, Tyneside, Teesside, Yorkshire and Humber, and up in Scotland, Grangemouth, and so on. And the use of existing oil and gas transport and storage infrastructure, repurposing of that. Nigel made the point, before I move on, as to new exploration. And of course, that is a big issue. We may want to come back to that in discussions and questions. But plainly, if a new round is allowed, operators are going to have to think, irrespective of whether they can bid, quite seriously about whether they should bid given both public perception, but also perhaps more importantly, the risk of stranded assets. If one is investing in abstracting oil and gas, which if, and that may be quite a big if, electric vehicles and the phasing out of gas for home heating go the way the government thinks they should over the next few years, whether there will be the demand there. But plainly, there will continue to be a demand, at least for some oil and gas, and that whether that will have an environmental effect will, of course, depend upon whether carbon capture and storage does kick in to neutralize it. So that is actually quite an important issue, I think, to be taken on board as part of that licensing round of decisions over it, which leads really into the next point, which are the barriers. What are the things that are going to stop all this happening? First and foremost, the CCUS isn't financially viable without some very strong price signals for those developing and those investing in development. Secondly, we're dealing, of course, with problematic first-of-a-kind technology, which always presents risks, uncertainties, and greater costs of capital and development than established technologies. The history isn't very promising here. The government has flirted with previous carbon capture and storage projects. Peterhead, that was sunk by effectively cheap coal, which made it uneconomic, and schemes at Kingsnorth and Longannet power stations, which were scuppered by spiralling costs and the 2008 financial crash. So there have been a number of false starts, and the government needs to not have a third false start with this. So the government's aim, it's a very ambitious one, is to aim to design a supportive business model and a new commercial framework by 2022. We also have to take account of possible public perception and potentially the public opposition to carbon capture schemes, either perhaps by concerns the public have, maybe misconceived, but real concerns to them over safety. And also, I think, whether the perception is that this is some sort of scheme to get the energy companies off the hook. That has to, I think, be guarded against as a perception. Next slide, please. The very good discussion of all this occurs in the House of Commons Select Committee for the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Department, which produced a report entitled CCUS Third Time Lucky ? Back in April 2019, so a couple of years ago. It basically concluded that the net zero target of the government was not credible without CCUS, that there were very favourable conditions in the UK for CCUS, but there was back then no consistent government policy support, that the government's ambitions on CCUS were commendable, but there was a serious lack of specificity in terms of saying that cost reductions were required before the government would support this technology, not saying what sort of cost reductions, and also the government's very vague ambition for its deployment at scale, whatever that meant. And the committee said that a kickstart was required. Next slide, please. So just to unpick what they said a little bit, I've set out three quotes from them. First of all, that the government's, the UK's expansive geological storage resource and world-class oil and gas supply chains mean there is a unique opportunity to lead the world in the development of this industry. However, there is a risk of losing any early mover advantage if the UK's progress is slow. Secondly, CCUS can impose significant costs. That's perhaps a bit of an understatement, huge cost potentially on industrial processes, and so will require substantial policy support to enable its adoption. However, the counter to that is that a failure to develop it could force many heavy industries to close in the coming decades, so steel, chemicals, cement particularly, if the UK sticks to its climate change targets. Those would just not be compatible with those industries operating in the UK without CCUS. And the committee thought that the benefits of CCUS on what it had heard by way of evidence were quite poorly understood across government departments, and in particular the Treasury. Next slide, please. And this is very important, I think. The committee said the greatest barriers are not technical nor legal, actually. They are commercial. It's inconceivable, they said, that the CCUS would be developed without government support. Witnesses to the committee agreed that costs could be substantially lowered by separating out the business model for carbon capture at industrial facilities from that for carbon transport and storage infrastructure. And that's, as we'll see, what the government's done. It's seen those as two entirely different bits of the CCUS process, the capture at the energy facility and then the transport and the storage of what is captured. So it recommended the government separates out the funding models and investigates the appropriateness of the regulated asset base model. And as we'll see, the government has picked up on those recommendations. So the government response to that report, essentially, it's all about money and it's all about risk. The government pointed to its CCUS Action Plan, where it accepted that the greatest barriers are commercial rather than technical. They had reviewed analysis conducted by various bodies who broadly concluded that you couldn't operate a full chain fixed price model. That wouldn't work in terms of absorbing the different risk appetites of the different organisations involved in the full chain. And it was concluded that a separate transport and supply business model would need to be established. So next slide. And that is what we see essentially in, I think, the various moving parts of all of this, which need to come together and mesh to deliver in very short order CCUS in the UK. So the government's CCUS Action Plan, that talks about the commissioning of initial projects for CCUS by the mid-2020s. Obviously, that's not so far away now. The CCUS Advisory Group, its industrial cluster mission, which is looking for the first net zero cluster of industry by 2040, and in fact, reduced zero cluster earlier than that. Funding on innovation for CCUS, although it has to be said that the sums there are, though measured in millions, quite modest sums, really. Work on potential reuse of current North Sea assets of the oil and gas infrastructure, with the possible carrot to the companies of the release of their decommissioning liabilities, which are significant, of course, if those assets are transferred into carbon capture, use and storage. And finally, for transport and storage, the adaptation of the regulated asset base model. Now, the regulated asset base model is a way of encouraging investment in huge projects, which stems really from the Thames Tideway Tunnel initially, as a way of having these projects being subject to economic regulation in terms of passing on their costs. So there is a way, an economically regulated way of passing through the costs to the ultimate consumer of what's being provided. In the case of Thames Tideway, the citizens of the Thames water area who pay their water charges plainly. That has been picked up in the context of nuclear. So for Sizewell C and future nuclear projects, if there are any, the government is now looking at some form of regulated asset base model to try and make those economically viable. Next slide, please. There is a consultation a recent consultation on sequencing the deployment of CCUS clusters, and you can see where the government is looking at those clusters, and you can see how many of them are actually on the North Sea coast, really, or very close to it, and how that provides a synergy with the North Sea transition. So there's a two-phase process which the government hopes will lead to a final investment decision on the initial limited number of clusters for 2022. That is acknowledged in the consultation as being highly ambitious and dependent on negotiating agreements with the private sector. And this is the rub, really, politically acceptable levels of risk and cost for taxpayers and consumers. The government got its fingers badly burnt on this with Hinkley Point C nuclear power station, where it came up with a deal with EDF, which was judged afterwards to be politically unacceptable in terms of the cost and the risk passed through to the ultimate electricity consumers. So the government will be keen to avoid that in this context. Carbon dioxide transport and storage projects will receive an economic license, allowing the project to receive a regulated fee from users of the network, those who want to put their captured carbon into the network and get rid of it, known as the TRI model. There will need to be a new economic regulator to be formed to do that. So that's the downstream bit of it, if you like. The upstream bit of it, where the power plant is actually capturing the carbon, those power plants which have carbon capture, use and storage, it said, will be operated under the grid in mid-merit order to complement intermittent renewables. As I said, that's seen to be their key function under a dispatch power agreement with the existing low carbon contracts companies. So that's how they will be effectively remunerated for fitting CCUS. Industrial CC projects, so chemicals, steel, etc., supported with a contract for difference-based contract with the LCCC. This is all dependent on writing an awful lot of contracts. So a lot of work, I think, for Adam and colleagues in other law firms doing this over the next few years. Next slide, please. Risks. This is I think, coming to the conclusion of my presentation. So this process does involve some high impact but low sorry, I think this is actually, yes, it should be low probability risks, but high impact risks. So the probability of them is low, the impact of them, if they occur, is high. If you find that your formation into which you have put all this carbon dioxide is proven to be leaking it out again, you have a big problem. That is probably quite a low probability, but a very high consequence. So CO2 leakage, asset stranding, you build all this and then you find there's no demand for it. You can't insure against those things, so who bears the risk? That'll be a matter for contract, of course. Initial projects will be negotiated rather than done by competitive tender. But future projects will involve sponsors taking pricing, cost or availability risk on CO2 disposal. However, to get to that position, there'll need to be a mature market for CO2 and the ability to hedge or fix future price. So you'll have to know, if you're engaging in one of these projects or investing in it, there will be a demand for your service of taking and storing the carbon and what sort of price you're going to get for it. That is, I think, the key issue really as to whether this is going to work. And finally, the government's view is that the plans for all this are not based on any brand new contractual or project finance techniques. They should be capable of being done through the existing toolkit. However, that will depend, as Adam said initially, on having that regulatory structure, economic structure in place. So that's my session. I will hand over to Tora, who's going to deal with decarbonisation.
Thank you, Stephen, and good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm going to be dealing with the decarbonisation of the supply and also the supply chain. And it's actually me who's doing the slides, so now I'm not working for my own talk. Apologies. There we are. Okay, supply decarbonisation. So here I've set out a quotation from the report, which makes no bones about just how ambitious the target is. So the deal is designed to change the nature of oil and gas production in the UK by 2030. This will be achieved through a combination of industry efforts with respect to operational practices and investment, appropriate changes to the regulatory regime, and the development of offshore infrastructure in parallel with the major changes already needed to significantly expand offshore wind production. So an ambitious proposal, and we can see that in the targets that have been set. So against a 2018 baseline, the government is expecting or requesting a 10% decrease in emissions by 2025, 25% by 2027, and 50% by 2030. The government has set out the measures that it will take to assist with this. And the first of those is to streamline the monitoring and reporting on emissions. Second, to identify potential funding opportunities for early stage offshore electrification studies. I'm going to come on to electrification in a minute. There's then the working with the sector to identify potential decarbonisation funding solutions, the OGA to promote the adoption of cost-effective electrification opportunities, and then the creation of an offshore implementation group to address regulatory and legislative barriers to electrification and other measures. So there are some government measures in there, but one can see that they are fairly nebulous with very few sort of well-defined proposals. There are, however, two definite proposals or focuses in relation to decarbonising supply. The first is the reduction of emissions from flaring, and the second, the electrification of assets. I'm just going to touch on both of those briefly. So flaring first. Now, flaring is obviously something that happens both as a matter of routine, but also is a safety control for oil and gas facilities. Flaring is obviously the burning of gas, a major source of methane emissions. And this is something that's very much in a sort of hot topic at the moment. And the World Bank has recently issued a report called Zero Routine Flaring by 2030. And that estimates that approximately 140 billion cubic meters of natural gas is being flared annually across the globe, causing 300 million tons of CO2 emissions. So you can see that potentially a huge benefit available if certainly routine flaring could be stopped or materially reduced. So an action plan is being developed on the reduction of methane, and the deal states this is likely to include zero routine flaring in the design of new builds, improved gas recovery in field development plans, and the development and implementation of flare management plans. Now, what's not clear from the deal, maybe we've got someone listening who'll be able to comment, is whether zero flaring is going to require significant the development of new technology, or whether that is something that is fairly is achievable. Turning then to the electrification of offshore assets. So the deal states that the largest sources of upstream emissions are from using hydrocarbon to fuel electricity generation, process heat generation, and direct powering of gas compression and pump systems. So if one could remove the hydrocarbons from that equation, then again, clear gains are available, thinking of those ambitious targets. And so the options under consideration are both full and partial electrification. And that could be done, there are three ways in which that could be done. One is connection to the UK grid. One is connection to the grid in Norway. And then also being considered is the potential to link offshore renewables, for example, wind, with oil and gas facilities and enable the oil and gas facility to be powered by wind. However, what's abundantly clear from the deal is that this is not cheap. It's going to require very significant investment. And the report states, well, this is likely to take a decade to deploy at scale. Now, remember, the 50% target is 8.5 years away. So query just how quickly this could be put in place in order to make to have a material benefit. The cost estimates given in the deal range very, very broad range between 0.2 billion and 2 billion, depending on the project. And then the expected reduction opportunities between 40,000 to 2 million tons of CO2 per annum. So again, it is a little bit nebulous in terms of what this will look like, what it will cost. And indeed, the deal states that the suitability of this, the approach taken, will of course depend on each individual facility. In order to deliver the 50% reduction target, it's clear that electrification is very much at the heart of that. And the deal states that between 2 and 3 billion pounds of investment will be required to allow the completion of at least 1 or 2 identified electrification projects. The government hasn't specified how that is going to be funded. It says it's actively looking at funding solutions, including match funding. It also proposes to set up an offshore implementation group, which would be led by BEIS and include the usual suspects in terms of those who will be sitting on the group. And the aim of that is to reduce regulatory and legislative barriers in order to achieve electrification. So, quick roundup on supply decarbonisation. It's fair to say that there are very significant challenges ahead in what is potentially a very short time frame in terms of funding, regulation, technology, and development requirements. And across all of this, there are significant implications for the legal sector in terms of any number of matters. For example, planning and environmental requirements, regulatory requirements, and obviously procurement. And as Stephen says, I'm sure that there'll be a lot of contracts too, so we'll all be kept busy. Turning then to supply chain transformation. Now, if someone had told me before I came to the bar and decided to be a barrister that I would spend 10 minutes looking for an appropriate picture on a slide entitled supply chain transformation, I probably wouldn't have bothered training to be a barrister, but there we are. But it's turned out that supply chains are actually more interesting than I originally thought. In terms of the North Sea transition deal, there are 3 aims. One is to make the supply chain low carbon. The 2 is to ensure the supply chain is UK based. And the 3rd is to promote the UK services to the world. And I think it's fair to say that the emphasis in the deal document is very much on number 2 and number 3 there. So although making the supply chain low carbon is mentioned in passing, there is very much a focus of this government on the economics and keeping the processes in-house, as it were. So just touching on each of those 3. So the deal does state that a new approach to transformation and capability development will be required to develop an all-energy, there you are, UK-based supply chain that can deliver decarbonisation at scale to meet the net zero target. Very, very nebulous proposals, again, in the document itself. And it sets out broad ideas to bring the sector together as consortia, to leverage capability and to deliver net zero projects and supply chain diversification. If anyone can provide a translation for this kind of language, then I'd much appreciate it. But essentially, it's really about setting a broad approach for the government and the sector to work together. And also that stretches to kickstarting new technologies, presumably across the breadth of the supply chain. Now, because the ideas are so nebulous in the North Sea transition deal, I think it's necessary to look elsewhere for what this may actually look like in practice. And in January 2021, the World Economic Forum and Boston Consulting Group published a report called the Net Zero Challenge, the Supply Chain Opportunity. And if you want to be interested in supply chains, this is the report for you, because what it sets out is the opportunity that is there in decarbonising the supply chain. And I think this quote really sums it up. So supply chain decarbonisation will be a game changer for the impact of corporate climate action. It enables companies in customer-facing sectors to use their influence in supply chains to speed and support rapid decarbonisation throughout the economy. And it can put pressure on suppliers in regions where governments do not yet do so. I'll stop there. But the point being that one of our issues, of course, in climate change is that there is disparity between nations in terms of the measures being taken. But because we have such a global economy, there is purchasing power within nations who do set ambitious targets for those companies through their, as I say, their purchasing power, through manipulating or controlling their supply chain, which may come from other countries which aren't so ambitious, and essentially enforcing a zero or a carbon neutral or low carbon agenda outside of the border of the host country of the company. So to my mind, that's an obviously quite exciting thought. So what would that look like in practice? Well, the World Economic Forum and BCG report sets out 9 initiatives which they state could be used by a company in order to ensure its supply chain is carbon neutral or low carbon. So first is the setting of a baseline, or sorry, the establishment of a baseline. Second, the setting of targets. Third, looking at your design of whatever product it is that you are producing and whether that can be done more efficiently. Fourth, looking at your geographic sourcing strategy. Fifth, your procurement standards. Sixth, the work jointly with suppliers to co-fund abatement levers. Now that does need some translation. Essentially that is across sector focuses on things like recycling, efficiency, renewables and carbon capture. The report actually sets out about 8 what it calls abatement levers, which the whole sector can look at. Next, work with peers to align sector targets that maximize impact in the level playing field. So again, a joint approach. 8th, using scale by driving up demand to lower the cost of green solutions. And 9th, internal governance, essentially setting your carbon neutrality, low carbon initiatives and goals at the heart of your business. So turning them back to the deal and what I said was the second element of the supply chain matters. So this is the aim that the supply chain should be UK based. And the reported aggregate value of the supply chain within the UK is said to, for the oil and gas sector, is said to be 26.5 billion in 2018. And so the government is very keen to keep this in-house, as it were. And so what it does is it seeks to set a voluntary target of 50% UK content, including capital investment over the life cycle of all low carbon projects and offshore decommissioning, as well as 30% for locally sourced technology. And so that's a voluntary target, but one can imagine that having some teeth if, for example, funding opportunities were dependent on it, or indeed there was some form of regulation. But at the moment it's expressed as voluntary. And then there is the appointment of a supply chain champion, for which I hope they get a badge, to be appointed to coordinate opportunities to help those who are members of a supply chain or parts of a supply chain to access government scheme providing funding support for low carbon energy projects. Then the third aspect of the supply chain dealt with in the deal is the promotion of the UK supply chain abroad. So The idea being that the UK will be, this government loves world leadership, so will be a world leader in low carbon supply chain matters, and that will then be promoted abroad. And there is to be the development of a global underwater hub, which sounds very James Bond, but actually it is a body which is intended to promote opportunities for our subsea engineering sector across the globe. So, but what about, so that's all the supply chain really within the UK. What about the global supply chain? Now, as I said, the World Economic Forum report was quite interesting in terms of the impact which a country can have by controlling its, or businesses within a country can have by controlling their supply chains. The North Sea Transition Deal is largely silent on it, but there is this statement on page 38. The government will support efforts to ensure free trade agreements and other trade policy mechanisms are as supportive as possible of clean energy, with focus on creating an exemplar green free trade agreement. So some acknowledgement there that the using the economic power levers of Britain in order to ensure green free trade agreements. And I think part of the wider context of this, I don't think we could leave this topic without just briefly visiting what's going on in Europe, because that may well influence the direction that the UK takes. And that's the big news headline over in the EU is the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. This is a measure which the European Parliament has recently voted to bring into force. And what it would do is impose charges on imports into EU countries of some raw materials to prevent carbon leakage, i.e. Prevent companies bringing in raw materials which have produced a huge amount of carbon and then using those in the onward processes within the EU. So at the moment, the EU has the emissions trading scheme, which only covers emissions generated in the geographical area that it covers. So that's the EU, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. And perhaps as a result of that, but commensurate with that, the domestic greenhouse gases within the EU have been falling, but emissions embedded in imports, i.e. coming from countries without such high standards, have been rising. And so the idea behind this is to address that and introduce a tariff on imported goods which haven't been, haven't had such tight standards applied to them. And there would be a credit or exemption applied to goods originating in a country which do apply some form of carbon pricing. It's a controversial scheme for some. There are queries as to whether it is compatible with WTO rules. The US in particular has publicly expressed some disquiet over the measures. And then the implications for the UK, of course, remain. Will the UK adopt a similar approach itself? Or will the UK have to align itself in some measure, in any event, for its own exports, not to fall foul of the CBAM mechanism? So that's one to watch. So just a few conclusions on supply chains. The proposals are currently very nebulous. I mean, perhaps we can't really blame the government for that, given the breadth of the processes within the oil and gas sector supply chains. Focus of the document itself is on economic growth as opposed to concrete proposals for achieving carbon neutrality. But that may simply indicate that further measures and guidance initiatives are on their way. But if we want to understand what may be required or what businesses may end up doing, then, as I say, the report of the World Economic Forum and BCG is extremely helpful in terms of understanding what may occur. So with that, I think I'm going to turn to Juan, who is going to address net zero and hydrogen.
Thank you, Tor, and good morning, everyone. Just to let you know that we are intending to turn to questions in about 20 minutes' time, so around midday. So that should be a lively discussion. So good morning. I thought I'd touch on net zero as well as the comparatively larger topic, hydrogen, certainly for the purpose of my slides, just to recall the discussion and the initial inspiration for net zero and see where the deal actually takes us in terms of either reinforcing or adding further detail within this important sector to the 2050 target. So with that, next slide, please. Thank you. So just to recap then on, and I could have added to this, but the key policy emphasis that have taken us to the date of the deal, obviously it was foreshadowed in the 10-point plan and then given further grounding within the energy white paper. I've added in there also the national infrastructure strategy because I go on to emphasise the significance of hydrogen and more so perhaps within the 2040 region, the growth of green hydrogen as opposed to blue hydrogen. I'll touch on that that discrepancy a little bit later on. But and some emphasis on the national policy statement because you will know that there is real room for some updating, if I can put it lightly, in relation to some of the MPSs, not least energy. Those of you who are involved in some of the energy from waste matters will know about decisions like DRAX, for example, that drew attention to the deficiencies of the energy national policy statement, albeit, as the Court of Appeal confirmed, there was no inadequacy in the decision taken there in relation to the North Yorks plant. But that really underscored that decision, the inadequacy of the NPS in relation to energy statements. So I've added that in there for a recap in terms of where we need to be, I think, in terms of the updating initiative. And we are told, and it's been resounded a number of times, that there should be a review towards the back end of this year, I think now is the present likely timetable, in relation to the most important energy policy statements. I could have added in also a couple more to that list, of course. We've got the planning white paper recently published too, and then of course there was the green future policy statement that really kicked things off back in 2018. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, in terms of the deal aspirations, and if I can couple this also with the policy thrusts that have taken us to the deal, effectively it just doesn't do away with the problems that exist in relation to oil and gas sector and in terms of whether or not the net zero ambition can be met, because there will be inevitably a number of practicable problems that will pose real challenges, I think, in terms of this sector. And previous speakers have touched on those already, but just a short list from me in addition. First of all, in terms of government investment, Stephen spoke to the various streams of income that will need to come forward in some guise and readily if certain ambitions are going to be realised, of course. But to what extent will government step in and lead the charge, if you like, in terms of delivering up on investment and within what timeline? To what extent, and I'll develop this later on in my slides, should we consider blue hydrogen a sustainable energy solution as opposed to green hydrogen, which seems to be the flavour on the continent in terms of their priority for securing green over blue? Obviously, they face different infrastructure challenges than the UK market does, but nonetheless, there is a serious question of to what extent, up until the 2040 timeline that's envisaged under present policy, that blue hydrogen can be characterised as sustainable. There's also the affordability question, of course, because entry into the market and to bring about the sort of serious changes that the deal presupposes in terms of hydrogen, as I go on to deal with, but also in terms of other priorities, as Stephen outlined, carbon capture, etc., will take a significant level of funding and relatively speedily in order to bring infrastructure up to date within the required timeline. So much of those pose really significant challenges in my view. I'm not convinced, and it may well be that this resounds some of the light touch criticism that the deal has received already from certain quarters, and perhaps of more concern to the government, certain environmental quarters, that the deal is properly prefaced on a realistic basis, certainly in whole. So just in terms of the light touch aspirations, I was careful not to frame this as commitments because the ambition at the moment on paper seems to be outstripping the reality and seems to be overlooking some of the credible challenges that this sector will inevitably face, not least in terms of funding. So certainly a new partnership between government and oil and gas industry, and that's secured. That certainly resounds the ambition that was prefaced in the PM's 10-point plan. It seeks to seize upon economic opportunities of decarbonisation and, of course, net zero targeting, and that reinforces what the sector was speaking to in terms of the roadmap 2035. And I've prefaced the economic environment for low carbon hydrogen production, but as I say again, in terms of blue hydrogen, there's a real query over to what extent that can be properly characterised in practice and in emphasis as a green energy solution. So the ambition really is to secure for this sector by 2050 compliance with net zero in alliance with all other policy ambitions. But it's right to frame that within this context, that the oil and gas production within the UK continental shelf is responsible for around 3.5% of total UK emissions. Now, on the face of it, that might seem rather light, but in terms of growing importance, I imagine that will increase over time. And then lastly, on this page, there's a commitment to a joint funding without apportionment of the funding stream for emissions reduction for the sector, between sector and state, of up to 16 billion by 2030. So that eye-watering amount isn't apportioned at present. There will be obviously some deals to be done, as Tor highlighted. We think that 10 billion on the face of it will be made available to support the hydrogen production sector, but again, no apportionment between blue and green hydrogen generation. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, £1 billion net zero innovation portfolio. The drivers under that portfolio, the triggers, and in terms of apportionment, no detail as yet. That's not a criticism, but certainly an alert in terms of what needs to be coming forward in terms of the detail for the stakeholders who are going to have to play a principal part in the delivery function. In terms of headline ambitions underneath the deal, certainly the emissions reductions, carbon capture, as Stephen helped us with, diversification of oil and gas on the supply chain, as Tora highlighted, hydrogen production, as I'll emphasise in due course, and concerns over job creation. Now, that I add with particular emphasis because it is one of the growing concerns of areas of the sector, and of course within particular well-affected parts of the UK in terms of the scale and the sheer energy for ramping up in terms of the blue hydrogen production and also the transition within the timeline anticipated from 2040 onwards, with a greater emphasis on green hydrogen production. Will that threaten jobs to any significant extent with the market, and to what extent can the market react to the energy transition? There will be incentivising repurposing, as it's put, of the oil and gas infrastructure in support of clean technologies. Add to that my query over to what extent I've raised the question that blue hydrogen can be characterised as clean. I think for present purposes, the argument must be that it is getting there, if I can put it that way. But until the ambition changes within the UK to transition in closer alignment with the continent, then that's how it must remain. Low carbon exporting, and Tora highlighted CBAM in terms of the query over to what extent exporting will be disincentivised moving forward. Capacity transformation, then the enablement of UK supply chain to deliver up on decarbonisation at scale, because it very much is a question mark to what extent this scale, ambitious as it will be, can be met. Again, all eyes then turn to the investment streams coming forward, at what time and in accordance with what apportionment, in order to meet with the net zero ambition. And then lastly, just to repeat the emphasis on the requirement for some updating of the energy MPSs, at least by the end of this year. On present timetable, it looks to be that there will be some thoughts coming back by the close of this year, we hope. Next slide, please. So in terms of implementation oversight, familiar concerns: how will it be enforced, who's going to police it, with what oversight, and who will be keen to respond first in terms of any formal or informal recommendations moving forwards. So a North Sea Transition Forum, we read, will be created, the scope of which is yet to be decided upon, the powers that it will exercise yet to be highlighted, but it's got to have teeth, of course. So alongside it, or as perhaps seen as a subset of this oversight body, will be a senior offshore implementation group in order to coordinate integrated energy projects. And that's given a timeline of by April 2021. Well, we're there already, and the detail isn't quite before us on how that's going to operate. So all eyes on that body moving forwards. And then later on in the year, although perhaps some slippage here also, a publication we read of business models in order to best provide for carbon capture for industrial and power generation, with the priority given there to blue hydrogen. But that also speaks to the timeline that's presently the UK's ambition. That will change moving into 2040, when it's seen to be more viable, or at least the market will be able to accommodate the transition more readily into green hydrogen. Next slide, please. So in terms of securing net zero and the commitment, an eye-watering target of 5 gigawatt of low, cleaner or clean energy, again back on the debate as to how you best characterise blue hydrogen. A key priority area, one of the 10, perhaps in the better half of those 10, in terms of the UK 1 billion net zero innovation portfolio. But again, how that's going to be realised in terms of revenues received to deliver up or assist the delivery up of the 5 gigawatt target is yet known, yet to be spoken to. And I can well understand that other priority areas have their own incentivising and own invitation to be made to government. But I really think that in terms of standing back from this, the hydrogen target of 5 gigawatt is one of those that is one of the strongest invitations to receive a larger share of the portfolio itself. It's going to be critical in reducing heavy industry emissions, and in terms of power and transportation, certainly in terms of transportation when one turns to the residual function for blue hydrogen. And then, as I've spoken to, in terms of the likely timeline for the UK, again, perhaps a step behind in terms of where the continent, in the UK, the EU is moving, the transitioning from blue hydrogen through to green and clean hydrogen. Blue hydrogen likely to be most commercially viable in 2030s. I think that remains realistic, with green hydrogen only making a move perhaps to the front in 2040s moving forwards. And that source is the OGA. Next slide, please. Thank you. Lastly then, on in terms of how hydrogen will secure on the UK net zero commitment, the announcement of super places. This is prefaced again within the PM's 10-point plan. It gained some further pace through the Energy White Paper, but super places and clustering throughout the UK. And I'll come on to some very recent exciting developments announced within March and the early part of April in terms of the mission and how it's going to be delivered up. So emphasis began within the White Paper, we know, and it said that there will be delivery up of 4 low carbon industrial clusters, so performing the function in alignment with blue hydrogen delivery, and 1 net zero industrial cluster by 2040 in terms of utilising all of the energy infrastructure functionality. CCUS, first of all, as Stephen helped us with, and then low carbon hydrogen production. So the locations yet to be firmed up, all of them at least. Teesside, as recently been uptick, but Scotland, South Wales, Merseyside, Humber and Teesside will be formulated as likely candidates for delivery up of super place clustering. Next slide, please. The recent announcements that I indicated then in March, it really gathered pace. Bacton Hydrogen Hub will be the supplier for London and South East. National Grid announced some gathering of pace in terms of Project Union, which aims to convert 25% of the country's gas network to carry hydrogen by the 2030 marker, and that's round about equivalent to a quarter of UK gas demand. And part of that process will be the identification of pipeline routes and the preparation in readiness of all the other related gas assets. And lastly, as I touched upon Teesside, BP announced 1 gigawatt hydrogen production facility for industrial clustering by 2030 at that site, and that's estimated to be meeting 20% of the UK's 5 gigawatt target, or should do, by 2030. Next slide, please. So off the back of all encouraging announcements in March, then, the headline target, 5 gigawatt 2030 target, is ambitious, but the sector thinks it can be met. And I don't think it's any more or less ambitious than the net zero target when we first heard about it way back when. So I think it's in alignment, it reinforces, and it means that momentum is maintained. Research and development on hydrogen, as you would expect. Offshore green hydrogen production is certainly one of the challenges that will be met. And again, that will be encompassing the timeline of by 2040, or is querying whether or not that is a challenge that could be met. And then some emphasis within the employment concerns that have been raised most recently in terms of the scale and the speed of ramping up will be to what extent health and safety practices will have to be looked at, re-examined, increased, and be enforced and policed moving forwards within those areas that readily need that greater superintendent. Next slide, please. And so a canter through government action, as the plan, the deal rather, provides for. These are not all of the action markers that sit alongside the hydrogen transition, but I thought some of the most significant ones. The carbon revenue mechanism, yet to be dealt with, all eyes on how the modelling will work and how the modelling, the draft modelling, is responded to as it's reported upon in the later part of this year. We're told that up to £4 billion worth of capital investment will be needed to develop the carbon hydrogen production, most of it at that stage blue, and again I do emphasise at scale, will be concluded upon. Hydrogen research and development and the testing programmes. Testing's already begun, of course, in terms of some sites. And government funding, again from the £1 billion stream, the innovation programme will be tapped into once it's concluded upon which tests have fared best in terms of moving forwards on production. And I've read commentary to the effect that transportation schemes will fare better than at first thought in terms of readying the gap that is provided for on electrification. So that's where there is ready support, whether or not it's properly characterised as clean and green enough hydrogen generation, the residual scope for blue hydrogen to serve a purpose. And so by that, attracting more funding, more revenues of the £1 billion Net Zero Innovation Programme stream. Ongoing studies and testing projects, they start at a readily early stage. And then lastly, options evaluation for major new hydrogen infrastructure. The optioneering process, I read, will go on well into next year, but that doesn't necessarily coincide with the formulation of the best tests in order to kickstart or tapping into at least streams from the £1 billion fund. Next slide, please. And so the transition continues. These relate to more government actions than in the plan. Some tinkering of the Gas Act will be needed inevitably in order to reinforce what will be required to be additional powers and responsibilities. Otherwise, I fear that the enforcement and policing of these actions, together with sector responses, may go unmet, or there may be some further slippage, certainly in terms of timeline and ambitions met. And that obviously will offset in terms of where this sector can respond positively to net zero ambition. Some acceleration will be needed, of course, in terms of hydrogen project and the planning process. I won't major on the planning process here, but I did read with some encouragement some of the emphasis on hydrogen processes being met within a more intensified planning process, a quickening up, if you like, of the planning scheme in terms of consenting and permitting of those sorts of processes. I think it's going to need it. And lastly, in terms of acceleration, it's got to be with an eye on commercialising the innovative low carbon tech and industrial systems if they're going to keep pace. Next slide, please. So the UK hydrogen strategy, it's a spin-off, if you like. It's certainly a European precedent already. Very good precedents running also in Germany, France and Spain. All of those are keener players in terms of green hydrogen at the moment, but they face their own challenges and their own encouragements in terms of moving that way at a faster pace than the UK will be able to manage. As I say, there's still a gap to be filled by the role of blue hydrogen alongside electrification. The strategy is anticipated to deal with the key steps needed in the early part of blue hydrogen and that function in order to deliver up on the 2030 target. There's going to be a clear long-term signalling of government commitment, we read, to a UK hydrogen economy. But I do say that that's going to take a clear steer from the European precedent. And then we anticipate a further clarification, because it's going to be needed, of government and oil and gas collaboration. At the moment, it's not clear. Inevitably, it's going to be led by the investment question as to what extent this partnership through the deal is going to move forwards. Next slide, please. The hydrogen fund then, and in terms of the creation of a net zero hydrogen fund, how this coincides with other revenue streams is a continued source of debate, but there's got to be some clear synergy and some clear triggering in terms of what stream is released first and what imperative will lead in terms of triggering required revenue streams. So it's going to be a fund in support of low carbon hydrogen production, providing up to £240 million of investment within a relatively speedy timeline. I'm not sure that's going to be met, but it's all good in terms of infusing the major players in order to look to what processes should come forward or could come forward if only the funding is received. And it's read to be, just to add to that emphasis, a major boost to production capacity to ensure that clean hydrogen can be utilised for decarbonising industrial clusters. So those will include the clusters that have already been spoken to in the earlier part of last month. Next slide, please. The unknowns then, if I can phrase them that way. I begin with figure 3.4 back on the, this was taken from the energy policy white paper. And it's seen within this at least, so I thought it was slightly disincentivizing to the sector to move forward or at least double its pace up in terms of where hydrogen sits. I think that's pretty pessimistic actually in terms of the overall scheme of generation for hydrogen, but nonetheless, that was a picture that was painted circa 12 months ago in the formulation of the initial strategy that fed into the deal. But I think the deal, in fact, if you put the deal alongside the energy white paper, I can see that the deal itself is rather more infusing in terms of the role to be played by hydrogen. And certainly that sits alongside some of the sector commentaries that I've been reading of late. Next slide, please. But on the clearer, if I can put it this way, the clearer unknowns and some of the queries that remain from the deal. So there's a definite synergy between the deal and the global ambition for net zero, together with all other strategies. I don't think you can draw any clear distinctions between them. But these are some of those that are going to need to be resolved moving forwards and within a clear timeline. There's certainly an attractiveness of private sector investment tools. The toolkit is just getting off the ground, of course, but it's got to be firmed up within a certain timeline. Government tells us it's going to be providing some preferred modelling by 2022 in terms of hydrogen, both green and blue, with the emphasis on blue for now. Longevity of blue hydrogen approach, well, that speaks to the requirement for blue hydrogen to be there to fill the electrification gap up until 2040, when it's anticipated, at least within the UK, green will take over, and to what extent carbon capture will be required alongside that. They are sharing, if you like, the responsibility for blue hydrogen if it's going to be argued to be a sustainable energy source. Diversification of end uses for clean hydrogen within 2050. The scope of that diversification will inevitably be determined by how responsive the sector will be. But that in turn will depend on revenue streams, because I can't imagine there will be too much encouragement if government turns around and points more readily to the private sector than it is anticipating already. It will be relied upon financially. The efficiency of hydrogen, the cost of production and scale, to emphasise again the ramping up of scale, is going to be at the fore of how successful or not the deal is in terms of hydrogen capacity and the extent to which hydrogen can drive forward in terms of filling the sustainable energy gap. And then, as I say, partners electrification in terms of the extent to which hydrogen may well fill sustainably the gap in terms of what electrification is doing already very well. I've heard commentaries to the effect that why should hydrogen come forward if electrification is successfully moving forwards already, and that's perfectly true. But in terms of hydrogen and the change-up, certainly it's got to be dealt with and secured by way of green hydrogen by 2040. So if you're going to test the water, if you like, it may as well step forward now alongside electrification. And the extent to which the electrification gap then will be met. I touch upon hard to green sectors. Certainly in the UK, such sectors exist more so than in the EU, but it speaks rather more to the different environmental geographical picture that the EU faces. Next slide, please. And lastly then, the inevitability of the need for blue hydrogen I've touched upon within these hard to abate sectors. Clear examples are cement and steel, if to a reducing extent. The exposure of the oil and gas sector is a particular risk, and I raised earlier, no less so in terms of those areas which are more vulnerable to unemployment increases. There is a concern that unemployment will increase inevitably within the market, within those affected areas of the UK, and I do think it's inevitable as part of the transition. Low gas pricing and low and volatile oil pricing is not a new concern or a new variable, but certainly one that may be exacerbated by the change up and the transition moving forwards. And certainly the sector has already voiced concerns as to how that may be catered for in terms of dipping into or apportioning the revenue streams from the 1 billion fund. Implementation oversight, that takes us back to the overarching policing and management function. Certainly that's got to be improved upon by the delivery up of powers and responsibilities, but how they will be divided amongst stakeholders, sector players, and with an overarching view of government is yet to be seen. There's got to be collaboration, of course, because otherwise the partnership, and the deal is very much prefaced on a partnership, won't work between those stakeholders. So at the moment, there is very much an emphasis for a true collaboration, if I can underscore true, between partners with experience and also with the know-how and the regulatory oversight to move forward. So that will encompass the delivery group alongside the government, with industry, of course, OGA and the North Sea Transition Forum, but that added query as against the forum, because it will be a new body. To what extent will it overlay with existing powers and simply serve lip service to the exercise of those powers? And then lastly, added participation, but again, to what extent might this duplicate with existing regulatory players for the offshore petroleum regulator for the environment and decommissioning alongside the OGA? I added a question mark there because there have been concerns of late as to who will look to what first and who is going to provide the clearest steer in terms of who enforces and oversees what. And I very much hope that that will be at the fore of further guidance moving forwards before one considers to what extent funding will be apportioned in order to enable that clear oversight. So I think that rounds off on my slides. If I might then turn back to Nigel, and then we'll head into the Q&A session and what we hope will be a lively debate. Nigel.
Thank you, Juan. It's now just after 12:10. This is, if we were all meeting together, it's time to reach for the glass of wine and the smoked salmon sandwiches, but not today. There are a few questions that we can deal with, either all together or for individual speakers. But could I just mention one that's come as a question at the end, and that's the fate of the slides. Some of the slides have been complicated, detailed, all inspiring and interesting. What we will do is send to all who have signed up for this seminar a link to the slides, which will be on the Chamber's website. So you can read them at your leisure and blow some of them up, certainly Adams to A1 and beyond, and study the detail. A question for everybody, really, but perhaps focus first on Adam. Will the deal work? Having listened to the speeches, I'm now more enthusiastic than when I first read the deal, which is a good thing. But I can see that there are problems, and just that general question, and I'll throw in a couple of other questions at the same time, and then whoever wants to can respond. A question has been asked: is it safe to inject CO2 into the ground, which is perhaps a reflection of the nuclear waste storage issues? So is it safe to inject CO2 into the ground, or are we storing up problems for future generations, accepting, of course, the immediate seriousness of climate change? And another general question is, in what ways can banks support the decarbonisation journey? So those three questions, if I could throw out to our panelists, and whoever wants to reply, speak first or put your hand up, and then we can start.
Shall I deal with the second question, Nigel?
Yes, please.
On safety. So it's a good question. I'm sure if you looked around on the internet, you'd find no shortage of comments or articles which would suggest the unsafe aspects of doing this. And it's true that it's largely untested. I mean, there have been some relatively small pilot plants which have injected CO2 into land, but I don't think they're small scale. I don't think we can learn too much from them. The most comprehensive study that I'm aware of was done by the University of Aberdeen in, I think it was 2018. They ran huge number of simulations as to scenarios where CO2 might escape. And I think what came out from that was that the escape would be much less likely if it's injected under the sea than under land. And secondly, it really depends upon the quality of the regulation. If you had scenarios involving a poorly regulated site on land, then the escape is much greater than if you had a well-regulated site in the seas. So I think it comes down to that, really. There are three, essentially, the study showed there are three routes by which escape might occur. One is through the well through which the CO2 was injected. As we all know, things can go wrong with gas and oil wells at sea, but that is a question of regulation, really. And if something is going to go wrong, we'll know about it probably fairly soon. The other ways really are through finding its way back through old abandoned wells, or secondly, through natural geological processes. And those really come down, I think, to the siting to ensure that you're not putting it into formations which present those risks. Unlike nuclear waste, which stays very dangerous for tens of thousands of years, CO2 actually gets safer the longer it's there, because it starts to mineralize and become solid and can't escape. So the University of Aberdeen thought it was safe. if one can say such a thing. But it does depend on the scenarios. Also, it's worth bearing in mind, I think, that even on the worst scenarios, we're not talking about escapes in tens of years. We're talking about hundreds of years, or probably actually thousands of years. So if you look at the imminence of the climate crisis, the alternative of not doing this is maybe we run into huge existential problems in 100 years' time. If we do it and it creeps out after 1,000 years, maybe that's preferable to not doing it and us all being dead in 100.
Thank you, Stephen. Anybody else want to deal with that question, or can we turn to the general question of will the deal work? And perhaps Adam can start.
Yes. I mean, I think just picking up on what Stephen said, I mean, in a sense, the other sort of comforting thing is that we're not talking about something which is going to be happening, in 500 places over the North Sea tomorrow. We're talking about an industry which has got a lot of places that it could go to choose this, and it's chosen one or two, which would have been licensed already. A lot of work has been done on them, and even some of the clusters are talking about using the same place to store their CO2. So it's that I think is comforting. In terms of whether the deal will work, I think from the government point of view, it sort of has to, because it rather likes the revenue it gets from the industry, and it doesn't want to be saddled with having to pay to decommission it all if it all just kind of fades away in an unregulated manner. So, but I think it only worked on its own terms. I do see it as a sort of political confidence building measure, and I don't decry for a moment the supply chain champion and the forum and all the good things that Dora and Juan mentioned. But for me, the more important is the OGA sitting there telling people, where they can drill, when they can drill, and no, they can't until they've got a plan to electrify that new platform. But that electrification thing is going to be hard, right? I mean, Norway has pointed out, as CCC points out, look at Norway, they've done a great job electrifying their platforms. Well, they've got a zero carbon electricity supply onshore and not too far to lay the cables. We are in no position to, I think, to emulate that easily. And so, maybe you're starting to look forward to things like little clusters of floating offshore wind that can, locate themselves near to in the deep water platforms and supply those. But I mean, that technology is at an affordable cost is going to take a little while to arrive. So I think there is a big challenge around reducing those emissions.
It looks like in the short term, in the 5 to 10 years, really short term, we'll know more about the mechanisms, more about the feasibility, and also we'll know a little bit more about safety, because by then we may be looking at some examples of it working in not just here but around the world. So Adam, thank you very, very much. Does anybody else want to come in on the deal, or can I ask you all about a question that I may have read out earlier? Let me read it out again. In what way can banks support the decarbonisation journey? Does anybody want to either add to what's been said so far or to deal with that question? Nobody wants to deal with banks.
Well, I mean, it's banks and investors generally. I suppose, well, they can invest in these projects, but they'll do that on a commercial basis if they think it's going to benefit their business model. I think it's interesting. I did note yesterday that some potential investors in Sizewell C nuclear power station had dropped out. I think from memory, I think one was the insurer Aviva, because they just didn't want to be associated with nuclear power, which may become an increasingly important factor really for lenders. so, you know, there is going to be a lot of money swashing around that has to be invested somewhere. And these green energy projects, if the financial conditions are right, are obviously going to be quite an attractive place to invest.
Yes.
Particularly if there can be some outcome, some use of the stored CO2, and then you might have a cycle of production. But also, Stephen says at the outset, this is at the moment a very tiny fraction of the storage. A question that perhaps this is for Tora, would CBAM apply to gas imports from the UK? Tora, if you can unmute and answer that one, I'd be very grateful.
Thanks, Nigel. Well, CBAM hasn't, the detail we don't have yet, but I think the indication is it may well do, because the desire is that it covers all of the industries and products that the ETS covers. So as the proposals are at the moment, the answer is probably yes. And then the question would be whether the particular gas imports would be somehow exempted, because by that point they would have proven their green credentials, as it were, whatever the requirement was of CBAM. So yes, I think yes, probably.
I think if I may, that there is the principle is that you judge other countries' exports by how their regime compares to the EU ETS. Now, we're supposed to have something which is of equivalent strength to the EU ETS by virtue of what we're tied down to in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. But you get into further questions as to whether you know, if you're looking at China, say, you're going to say, well, this steel manufacturer is actually green as opposed to the others who aren't, and so you have, you know, mechanisms that apply to individual, end up applying to individual production. And of course, that's a thing which could go up as well as down in terms of how it discriminates against people. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of discussion on that.
Yeah, there's a very interesting paper from the LSE about
yes,
UK-EU interrelationship on exactly those issues, and what the UK is going to, how we're essentially going to have to respond in terms of ensuring that we don't fall foul of CBAM. So, I mean, I think there is still quite a bit up in the air, and there is hanging over it the WTO question.
Yeah,
and you know whether it will fall foul of that, but yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, it remains to be seen, but there is a risk, I think.
A couple of other questions have come in from attendees. One is linked to the investment that I mentioned earlier, but could I read out this one to you all and your response? Could I first read out for your benefit? It starts with the words "excellent presentations," which I thought you might all like to hear. And the question is this: is this deliverable in the sense that it will be properly governed between the various countries, that is, global trade in the supply chain, who validates the performance of each country regarding net zero? Who wants to have a go at that one? You just want to hear excellent presentations again, don't you?
Yeah, just keep saying that. That's fine, Nigel. Well, I mean, this is a question of, you know, public international law and public international governance, isn't it? Which is extremely difficult. I mean, we can do as much as we want in the UK. We're simply a drop in the ocean compared with the US, China, etc. So this is all going to depend, isn't it, on how things go forward in the COP process following Glasgow, and whether we can actually, you know, translate good aspirations by countries into, you know, a policeable framework. I think that is going to be, frankly, extremely difficult, but it shouldn't stop us doing what we can in the UK.
Just to add to that, if I may, in terms of precedent setting, I think it's important as well, because turning back to the hydrogen sector, there's a strong precedent being set already by Europe. I mean, in terms of the way in which it's moved forward so quickly in terms of green hydrogen is a precedent setter for the UK. So if by the back door there's a collaborative effort with a minor stick, if I can put it that way, over the way in which the UK may move forward. So not a formal agreement or a formal thrust, but it's certainly something that's a collective effort. And there's a real incentive, I think, for the UK to move further forwards at speed following that precedent. So absent agreement, you can see nations moving forward, but it's shy of a global movement.
Anybody else want to comment?
Well,
on that?
just on that, there is the point that if the more you have things like CBAM and other, the EU isn't the only place talking about it, and with all the other ESG emphasis and other climate disclosure and all those things, people are going to want to. There is going to be effectively a premium on lower emission hydrocarbons, and so other jurisdictions are going to want to find ways of doing the sorts of things that the deal talks about. Now, if you're Saudi Arabia, it so happens that naturally you don't have many emissions because it's so damned easy to get the stuff out of the ground. If you're Canada, it's a lot harder, right? And so I think, and then there was I was trying to find the reference. I can find that there was one of the things that came out of the Biden summit last week was quite an interesting sort of coalition between, I think, the US, Canada, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, precisely around this kind of reducing emissions of production, and that's sort of 40% of the world hydrocarbon production is right there. I don't know what they actually do, but it's a good sign.
But thank you, Adam. I think we should close this session in a couple of minutes. It's been 2.5 hours of intense and very interesting material. But could I ask, on behalf of one attendee, a question, and then my own general question to wrap up? The question is, can you comment on the likely return on equity that investors will require to invest sustainably, i.e. without subsidy, in hydrogen production and CCSU? The risks look similar to oil and gas upstream and midstream rather than utility risks. Anybody want to have a stab at that? But I'll hang in the last question, which is, we've all been pretty optimistic about this, but could I ask this question? What are the consequences of failure of the CCUS proposals?
Well, I can deal with that. I mean, I think that they are very serious, aren't they? Because it's, as I said, it's a linchpin of much of what goes ahead. So if it doesn't work, I think our net zero aspirations are probably in tatters, really. And there is, so far as I can see, no real plan B for it not working. So I think, as someone said earlier, it's got to work. The government's got to make it work.
It's almost a test case in can you regulate a new market into existence. And as far as the return on equity is concerned, I mean, I'm not going to do numbers. There's things you can read for that. But what's interesting is that you've got different people involved. You've got oil and gas. There's a lot involved, and so, but who also know the risks associated with geology. But you'll have others, the emitters and so on in the clusters, who come from different backgrounds. But what the regulatory framework has got to do is try to just achieve certainty, relatively speaking, and that's what will help the banks to invest. That was the question earlier. Because once upon a time offshore wind was a bit risky, but look at it now.
Thank you. That's fine. Any other contributions, or can I bring this session to a close without mentioning, as I was intending to mention at the outset, that this is more interesting than the introduction of the right kind of seaweed to stop cows burping, but that's for another session. Thank you to all the speakers, and thank you to all those who've attended this webinar. If you do have further questions, then perhaps fire them into Chambers or into Dentons, and we'll try and provide responses. And as I said at the outset of this final part, the slides themselves will be available as a link on Chambers' website, and that will be sent to you all. Thank you very much for attending. It's been, for me, an education and a pleasure to listen to these speeches. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.